Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a long day. A good day, though, right? All right. So I hope everybody got some snacks inside in them. If you haven't, go take care of that. This is our last panel of the day, and I hope the energy stays the same level it's been all day. We have a great panel, and so I know they want to be able to talk to you, and I hope you have some good questions for them. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Oh, I need to introduce myself. I am Katrina Debnam. I'm a professor here at UVA in the School of Education and Human Development. And this panel is on health and well-being. And so I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you all for letting me join you today. It's been a lovely way to learn from you all. I'm Julia Taylor, not the Julia Taylor in the Curry School, but the other Julia Taylor who frequently gets her emails in the School of Medicine. So I am a pediatrician by training, but I did a fellowship in adolescent and young adult health. So the population I care for is sort of 11 to 26-year-olds at the UVA Teen and Young Adult Health Center. I'm also by training a clinical ethicist and researcher in empiric ethics, and my work there focuses primarily on value and preference sensitive decisions that youth have to make in a medical center or setting and how we support that or what factors support that, specifically looking at gender minority youth and choices about family planning and reproductive outcomes.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Fantasy Losada, and I'm an associate professor in psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University, where I direct the School, Home, and Internet Context of Emotional Development Lab, mouthful, but we like to call it SHIELD because I'm a comic book nerd. I study the emotional development of Black and Brown families, and I'm currently doing 2 studies, one on emotion regulation development among African American early adolescents, and another on youth participatory action research and social emotional development as a mechanism for sustaining activism.
Okay. My name's Hannah. I'm from Sisseton, the Sisseton area. I'm Dakota Sioux, and I'm here with Nishto and Destina.
Ha mitakiapi. Sitamne shapi we amakiapi. Rashichi chaje Destina gil. Sisi tawa ukbetima oyate. Sisseton, South Dakota. I'm Destina Gill. I am the executive director of Nishto Incorporated, a Native nonprofit that we developed in 2016. We have a short video to share who we are, just to kind of give you a little sight of who we are in a nutshell. Nishto is a Dakota word that means concern for others outside of yourself. When it comes to our Native youth and young adults, we must be aware and understand their strengths and the barriers before them. Our children are told time and again that they are a statistic, and when you hear that over and over, you eventually come to believe in those limitations. Our children aren't statistics. They are the walking prayers of their ancestors. We have heard countless times of how trauma is in our DNA. What we need to tell them is, so is the strength of our people. Opportunities create experience, and experience creates confidence. Have you ever seen a confident child? The world becomes their fishbowl. A cherished Dakota elder, Dorothy Gill, always said, "We are born just like everyone else. Someone had the compassion to fill the blanks in and teach us what we know. Sometimes we are a collection of all the people who loved us." That is a message we give them when we ask, "Where do you get your medicine?" Nishto Incorporated is a Native nonprofit located on the Lake Traverse Reservation of South Dakota. Our mission is to promote and provide youth and young adults skill building, leadership development, educational experiences, and reentry for our young people returning home from incarceration. Engaging our youth in their communities and building confidence to seek opportunities outside of the reservation requires innovative concepts using our Dakota values and culture.
Doing stuff like this helps me be spiritually stronger, like doing something traditional like picking red willow, like what we did today. And we picked some in the background.
Nishto is a boots on the ground, services first, volunteer-driven organization that understands the concept of not about us, without us, when working with the youth and young adults. Nishto was created to meet the needs of the youth and young adults who fall in the cracks of the system.
And thank you all for being here today. In our planning meeting for the conference, we talked a little bit about how some of the systems that we all interact with are not set up to kind of hear the voices of youth and how that affects their health and well-being. I was wondering if you could each talk a little bit about that in your own work and what that means.
So I think, again, when I think about systems being slow moved to change, I think about the healthcare system, and that we have a lot to learn from the educators in the room and the youth in the room. And the idea of centering youth voice within the healthcare field is like new, where you guys have been doing this for a long time. So I've really absorbed a lot of what you have said. And I think that, again, the systems that have been created to promote health and wellness among youth, again, may not have had them at the table originally. So we have some dismantling to do and some rebuilding to do. And I'm fortunate enough to have colleagues across grounds who have YPAR as a method for developing youth capacity and changing systems. And so, again, I am new to this field and have felt very fortunate to sort of sit here and listen as someone in healthcare to how other fields have moved and recentered around youth voice, because I think that, again, we're still stuck in a stage of risk, right, and risky behaviors, and how do we, prevent harm as opposed to using the promise of adolescence. And we're still thinking of them as vulnerable populations that we have to protect. Whereas it seems here we just need to ask a lot of good questions and we'll get the information we need from them rather than assuming that what we know is accurate anymore. So again, I'm feeling very grateful to my colleagues, and I think they'll have more to say about their work too.
When I'm thinking about the systems that are set up against the youth that I'm working with, I'm thinking about the literal structure of the cities that they're residing in and the neighborhoods that they're residing in with. So for instance, I'm in Richmond, and our Black youth are disproportionately most represented in neighborhoods with the lowest amount of resources, the food deserts, less access to positive youth development opportunities if there are any there in the first place. And that being, just set up, it's in the design of where they live, right? And then it also means that they're connected then with lower resource schools. And so it's a structure that is set up to, as I've been talking about a lot lately, to sort of habitually activate negative emotion without the resources to be able to learn about or to process those negative experiences, those negative emotions. So as I'm starting to work with youth and I'm asking them about the change that they want to see or things that they're wanting to be able to have in their communities, they first start with, I can't even go outside. And I said, tell me more about that. There's bodies out there. People are dying. And then I have to reflect it back. And I said, so you said that there are people are dying there. Do you know that that's not what you deserve? That's not the environment. That's not the experience, that you as a youth can't go outside because you fear for your safety. But those are real structures and systems that are set in place that made that by design. And then when you come to school, then there aren't even the appropriate number of trained staff or social emotional support staff in the school to be able to help you process the trauma that you experience on a regular basis that you're systematically exposed to. And it's a little bit of a conversation that is trying to sort of awaken some and give them language for a critical lens of their world and their environment, to provide them with also some tools to be able to think about that, but process literally what it feels like in their body, so that it doesn't manifest in these outcomes around their physical and mental health. And so I'm just thinking about those very real structures that are set up, like where they live and where they go to school at, where they live and breathe, that are set up against them.
Oh, I was asking about the structures that you all have that are in place that kind of don't center youth voice related to health and well-being, and how you've seen that play out in the work that you do, or have you seen good examples of that?
I see a lot of good examples of like the systems and structures not being able to be there for the youth. A lot where I live, and like it especially affects like a lot of people who I'm like related to and friends with, and it also like affects me. So being able to like feel how it's affecting us youth, and also being able to see it among the other youth it's hard, honestly, but it's something that at the same time, okay, so at the same time, I want to be able to be there and fix it, and like all of these. I'm getting, but okay. So all these structures in the community that I like, the way they affect my community that I live in now is there's not very much like mental health or like physical health resources readily available, because I've seen a lot of my family members struggle with a lot of stuff and being sent back to like say IHS or something, and being prescribed something that's not going to help, and then still having problems, and then having to live with that because they can't like afford to go to see like an actual like better doctor sometimes. And then also like with the mental health thing, a lot of the youth in my area, I see it and I hear about it, and like sometimes you don't even have to have someone talk about it, you can just feel it. It's heavy, and like okay, so a big part of this is like the school and I feel like the social media and being the newer youth in this generation is being exposed to a lot more of the social problems, and these structures are coming up, and people are being more aware, and especially in like these areas, it can kind of be like a little disheartening, to have to be this young and like facing these kind of structures. And sometimes like it's not something like we can post about it on social media, but it's not something a whole lot of people talk about in person, because people are afraid that someone else is going to say something to them and like push them away about something. But it's something that being that kind of thing makes us feel alone about in these structures and these systems. But my goal, especially like being with a part of this group, is like to be able to like bring awareness and help people feel less alone with this kind of thing, because it's a whole bigger thing. It's like we say mental health and it like shrinks it down, but it's like a whole spectrum of like things that like not only affect like the individual but the people around them. It affects their community and the society, and yeah.
Part of our work is to dismantle the different systems and structures that exist because funding goes to that. If you're beaten, brown, and broke, there's money for you. There's money for organizations who say they're going to work with those individuals, but the intentionality isn't there. You get a good salary, you get a fancy office building, all of those things that come with it. But by the time all of those things are done, there's nothing left for the actual services. There's pennies, and it's like saying you're going to make soup, but you don't have a pot, you don't have the water. So in the video, when we had said that, because on the reservation, a lot of different organizations and universities will get a grant, and we call it data reaping. They come in and they say, well, we're going to come talk to your youth. How many times have you been sexually assaulted? How many times have you tried to commit suicide? They do all of these things, they get the information, then they leave. We have IRB boards now in place to protect us from that, but it still happens. And a lot of it triggers our youth, and like she had said, the lack of resources. So changing the structure of the expectations that people think we're supposed to be in. A quick story: when my father was young, the Indian agent, every reservation had an Indian agent, still do, but they call them something more fancy. The Indian agent came to the house and looked around and said, you are all living in poverty. They had 2 gardens, they had cows, they had chicken, they had everything. Their grandparents lived with them. So while my grandma and grandpa were working and providing, they had the grandparents to give them what grandparents give their grandchildren: lessons in life, the compassionate, all of these things. But according to this man, they were poor and impoverished. And we talk about whose standards are you putting people up to? What are you according to this? And that's the lessons we teach the kids, because people come in, or they go to there's 5 public schools on their reservations and 2 tribal schools. And they go to public school and they're told they're less than, they're disposable, you're not as smart as. So our work is around dismantling that process, so they know how to question it or disregard it if they choose to. Just because they said that doesn't mean it's so.
Thank you for sharing that. Are there, or have you seen examples in your work where that there are centering youth voice and thinking about health and well-being? And if you would want to share any of those.
Should I go first?
If you'd like.
So an awesome story I like to share. There's a site on a reservation. When the government created reservations, they gave those reservations to a religious organization. And nine times out of 10, it was Catholics. So there was a huge Catholic orphanage on a reservation. And kids, I don't know if you guys are aware of the swoop, they call it, when it went from the only good Indian is a dead Indian to kill the Indian, save the man. So that's when that had happened. Well, the site of the orphanage, we tore it down in 2011, 2012. And we talked about what should we put there, because it's triggering time to drive by it. And we built a park, beautiful park. But the input we got was from the kids. Gathered them up, different areas, and said, what would you guys like to see? The little kids are saying this and that. My favorite part, because it was one of my projects, was going and gathering up all the skateboarder kids from everywhere, because they'd always get in trouble for skating on the church steps. And we sat down, and I said, I know nothing about skateboarding. I'm not going to pretend to. What do you guys want? And I partnered up with a company who builds Tony Hawk's parks called Spawn Ranch out of California. They flew in. They were excited. And we had probably 4 different meetings. They came up with the designs. We had to be realistic, what we could afford. So we did that, and we had pizza, and the kids kept, coming back and saying what they had wanted. And they built it, and the kids are sitting on the grass watching it get built, asking all these questions. So they know all these Spawn Ranch people by name now. They want to do phase 2 of the park. But every time I go by the park, I get really happy, because a lot of those kids are now Hannah's age or the other kids' age. And they say, we built that park. So they have little footsteps in their community.
We've been doing a lot of listening sessions with various people in the communities that we're working with this particular high school, and we were kind of talking to the youth there about what are some, examples that you've seen where youth have been able to make a difference in your community. And one of their favorite things to share was actually kind of like was a moment where there was a lot of pain because it was a recent loss of a young person, of a high school student who had been shot. And so they were having a community vigil around that, and just kind of making a safe space for community members to grieve over the loss of this young person. And someone went and there was a group of students there, a group of kids there who they were friends of this young person. They were kind of standing around, they're grieving, they're kind of holding space for each other. And one of the adults from the school that the students really trust and care about a lot, they went over and engaged with them a little bit, and they were kind of just really encouraging them to express. They were expressing a lot of anger and their sadness, and kind of letting them just get it all out. And in that, one of the young boys, he was kind of just going on in this rant, and then he said, and all we just really wanted was a place to go play ball. All we wanted was some place to go and be safe. And why can't we even do that? And I think it was in this space where the kids felt safe to be able to express themselves, and they had this moment to be able to express all that they were feeling, and they were able to make this ask that I think they felt like it was a big ask almost, right? But the adults there who were really listening, they worked with those youth to create then an open gym space and open hours and an accessible way for them to get to that gym and to be safe, especially when it got dark earlier. And I was just thinking about that in terms of youth having the space to be able to express, but the capacity to be able to express, to work through their emotions, and then to kind of get through to this thing that they wanted to have. And what I love about thinking about this was that the youth in particular, this was a story that they weren't a part of, but that they knew other youth in their community have been able to get something done. And they used that example of other youth expressing themselves and raising their voice and working with adults to make something happen. They're using that as a beacon of hope for themselves for other things that they want to change. And so I think it's in youth's capacity to be able to express, and also to hear each other and listen to each other and learn from each other's examples, that I think is really powerful and will be, helpful in moving, the fight forward for their health and their wellness.
Don't want to leave you hopeless about the healthcare system. So I think actually healthcare providers are better on the individual level. So that idea of shared decision-making of the youth walking into the clinic with an experience that is valid and actually probably the driving factor for why we're all in there, I think has been readily adopted, right? We have shifted away from paternalism. We are into shared decision-making, even in pediatrics. And so I do think that on an individual level, there can be youth-friendly services and youth-friendly providers who, again, allow youth to be the expert of their own lives, and that carries a vast amount of weight in that clinical decision making, right? It's not just the physician who has this ownership of this knowledge, right? That exchange system that the education system has pushed back against, right? I'm not delivering something to them. I am exploring options with them, right? So I do think that, again, there are opportunities for youth to feel heard in sort of their own clinical decision making. And again, I think that there have been aspects where youth have pushed us. And again, providers have been led by youth, specifically thinking about gender affirming care, who have said, I'm coming to you and this is my lived experience. And then, gray haired people in medicine had to say, I hear you, and this is what we'll do together, And so I do think that there are opportunities there for us to go even further, and mostly in the research setting, really. I think about, again, one-on-one clinicians being very different than the data that drives the discussions that we're having. If youth aren't, if they're just responding to surveys that don't let them have an active role in healthcare, data, I think it's challenging. So again, I think there are some spaces there where we have moved.
That's hopeful. So clearly in all of your responses, you talk a little bit about culture and how it's important to kind of shaping youth voice and what they're looking for in agency. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see that working in your respective areas? How does culture?
The entire foundation of our work is based on culture, namely Dakota culture. There are a few kids that we work with that are from other tribes, so we do what we need to do based on, the tribe, because we don't want them to feel the way we know how it feels in mainstream society where there's not spaces for us. Within my lifetime, I feel old, and then I know, I'm not. But within my lifetime, there was, when I was younger, there was a lot of shame in being a Dakota person. Nobody wanted to be Indian because of the things that came with it. But one of the nice parts of seeing that is seeing how it evolved to where there's so much pride in that now. You hear that a lot. Dakota, I'm a Dakota. Or if they see one another, they'll say, Dakota hai, are you a Dakota? And and it's something we see and we know. If we see another Native anywhere, there's just that thing. We always acknowledge each other. So the work we do, and we partner a lot with UVA, but we always make sure we put a Dakota lens on our work and try to educate and inform as much as we can with our partners on, our expectations of their understanding and reciprocity of that.
Okay, for me, it's kind of slightly more of a personal experience, but I grew up grew up off the res in an outside town, which is predominantly white, and it's not the greatest, I'm not gonna lie, but I grew up and I was born and raised there, and we did move around for a while, but we didn't really move up to the res till like a couple years ago. But I spent most of my childhood and most of my life growing up around white people, and I can say white people because all the areas that I grew up, it was not very many colored people, and that kind of made me feel excluded almost, and especially since, I don't know, racism wasn't extreme, but it was definitely there, and it definitely affected me. Growing up without being attached to my culture, being like knowing who I was, like, and who I came from and where I came from, it had a big impact on my mental health and like my self-esteem almost, because I kind of felt like I was just at one point I didn't even feel like I could call myself like indigenous because I didn't really have like any connection to my culture. But being able to be a part of like this group is like what I was getting at. Has brought me closer to my culture and has brought me like much more opportunities to be able to do things that allow me to learn more and like spread my knowledge and what I know and connect with more people who are also like me and people who like are accepting, and yeah, it's pretty yeah.
When I think about this question, I think about first that recognition that we all have culture, that it's not just certain people have culture, right, and other people don't. And so youth are navigating all the time multiple sort of cultural spheres and cultural influences, and some of that is a culture of being young, right? And you've been hearing our young people talk about that culture today, and how important that is to them, and how they see the world through that culture. They are navigating sort of the sort of when to play the youth, right, and when to be quiet, to let adults have that. I loved that earlier, kind of like adults want to like be told that they're right. That's like cultural navigation there to even recognize that, and to know like when to leverage that. And then, of course, there's ethnic, racial, cultural norms and things that are being passed around down from family members to family members, between communities, between peers. And so it's all at play when it comes to shaping youth agency, and youth are sort of making sense of how are people in the world responding to me, and how do I manage that, especially when I have these needs to be able to express myself. I have these needs to feel autonomous. When I know that I know my experience, how do I get people to listen to me? Youth are navigating that with their own parents, right? Parents who are coming from a different generation, who I talk with Black parents all the time, who are afraid that if they kind of let their youth take the lead, or if they let them kind of be out there to be an activist, that they're scared for their children's safety. And so, of course, I'm going to tell them to sit down and be quiet because I want them to come home at night. And of course, I want them to be free to express themselves, but I know that we live in a world in which they cannot do that safely. And I'm afraid for that. And so it's so complex when you think about how is culture shaping youth agency, because there are those multiple influences of culture. And I think that what we've been talking about today, sort of giving youth even the space to explore their culture. I love hearing the experiences that you're getting to have to explore your culture that you felt like you weren't able to grow up with initially. Because that's, I think, part of youth being able to take that agency as well, is to be able to play into their culture, claim their culture, explore what it means. What does it mean now? What did it mean then? How do I connect to those who came before me? And using all of that to empower themselves to raise their voice when they know that they come from a legacy of resistance, when they know that they come from a legacy of people who didn't just, accept the status quo, but they navigated oppression in all these different ways. And at the same time, because I never like to just talk about a culture that is in response to oppression, because our cultures are not just in response to oppression. We make active choices to have joy, despite whatever influence is trying to knock us down. So, sorry, it's a little bit of a word vomit at the end of there.
So, thinking specifically about health and well-being and healthcare, we talked a little bit about like this ethical imperative to center youth voice in that process. Do you want to comment or talk about that?
I'm happy to start. So again, if it's impossible for me to fulfill my duties of beneficence and non-maleficence, like first do no harm, if I don't actively engage youth. And again, I felt really comfortable with that in my clinical practice. And now the question for me has become, how do you then inform the data that informs your clinical practice, or take your research to the next step? Like you can always see the problems in medicine. That's not like a hard thing to do. But then you're sitting in a room with a bunch of other researchers or a bunch of other clinicians and hospital administrators, and you're like, well, what do we do to fix this? And suddenly I was like, well, why would we be the ones that would have the knowledge necessary to fix that? Because it's not, again, like we need the youth voice there. So again, the ethical imperative became for me that we move towards a model of research with, as opposed to research on youth. And protecting vulnerable populations means that they're excluded from the data. So like big trials don't have adolescents in them, right? Like it was a big push to get adolescents included in pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV prevention, right? And so again, by labeling youth as vulnerable that need to be protected rather than who need seats at the table, we've done them a disservice in terms of their healthcare. So that's when it became sort of like an ethical imperative in my mind.
I think as I think about this question, and I think about my journey as a researcher, I think about being trained in all different kinds of methodologies of questionnaires and observation. And throughout that journey, me kind of questioning like, well, but to capture whose experience, or to understand whose experience, and understanding that the things that I was being trained in, just kind of even putting aside, just thinking about like a systematic inquiry of scientific inquiry, I just realized that there wasn't always space being made for everyone's perspective when you say that the only way we can understand something is to ask this interval-based Likert scale question, right? And then to run a mean on it, and then to compare it to other people's responses. And so when I think about that ethical imperative, I do think about that in terms of how, even as a researcher, I'm growing myself and challenging myself about how is it that we think that we can know the experience of a youth without directly asking them that. And we can ask them in all different kinds of ways, but also now in the engagement and sort of more of that participatory research perspective, them to literally be at the table with me as a scientist or as a researcher, because they are scientists. Someone was mentioning Chris Emden's work earlier. They are scientists, and they already take note and observation of all these different things that are happening in their daily lives. And so I find it an ethical imperative as a researcher to work together with them to be able to draw light on research that is really meaningful and truly respective of their experiences, so that we can use that research for change, and we can use that research to kind of argue for and make a claim on their liberation in all different types of ways.
One, I think creating a space to add more steps and the different processes before and after, definitely an after for feedback if it doesn't exist. Another one is to have the conversations with coworkers or somebody who's working in that field. There was an incident of a young man who had tried to take his life. And if you're not familiar with suicidal issues on the reservation, sometimes they're common. They come in groups. Well, when you have doctors, non-native doctors, they're pretty sick and tired of it, and you can tell. So you're in the ER with the family, they're scared that their child had, might be dying yet, all of these different scenarios. And the doctor comes in, he's like, oh, well, here we go. Just like he's ordering a cheeseburger. And there's a lot of shame involved in shaming the parents, like, what did you do? So the parents don't ask the questions that they need to. Part of our work is being an advocate for that. We spent many times sitting even in hospital rooms because it was too much for the parents, and advocating for that patient, for that kid or their families, because the doctor was just sick and tired and fed up. And one doctor had given that boy a catheter. He said, well, next time he thinks of doing this, maybe he'll remember this pain. And that was his way to fix it. And I asked the nurse, I said, I don't think that's right. Like, who says something? Well, he's the doctor. So right there I saw, how do we have the doctors and nurses have the conversations, because even if they know, and then the amount of shame that they put on the parents, they felt they couldn't ask that either. So it was just another trauma on top of the traumatic experience of living, in that situation. That's still an ongoing thing that we're still trying to figure out, but I'm glad I get to stay here in front of you guys to take that and do whatever with it.
I'm really glad you said that, because as I've been listening to this conference, and especially that, I think, again, as I think about what we're asking youth to do in this role, there's more for me to do in terms of, adults who don't just tolerate youth, but embrace youth, embrace the possibility of failure, embrace risk-taking, right? Like all the things that we know youth are pretty good at. And so again, I sort of feel deeply like the ethical imperative of not just being comfortable with like my one-on-one interactions, but again, like creating like leadership structures that value this type of work and the responsiveness to communities, right? And again, that goes to like who we recruit for medical school and nursing school, right? So again, there's a lot of things to think about there, but that's been, as I've listened through the course of today, that's become a clearer and clearer ethical imperative that we have to go back to like who we're putting in positions of power that aren't responsive to community needs or youth needs.
Well, And with that in mind, and one of the things that I think we, I don't know if we talk about enough, is the kind of this by asking for youth voice and agency, we are putting some burden on them to do this work. And if you have thoughts about how to do that in a way that doesn't compound the trauma that they may be experiencing while they're trying to navigate through health and well-being and self-care, how to get their voice, but not put an extra burden or strain on them to do it.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately because it's very much what drew me to some of my current studies, because it's such a big ask and it's a really big, heavy burden that we place at youth's feet and say, tell us about your experiences, and now tell us everything that we need to do to change it, and tell us how to fix these systems that you didn't create, and as if that's their responsibility and their job to do that. And so, where we've been starting at has been to kind of talk about the lay of the land, right? And to get their perspective of that with regard to the places that they're not feeling safe and the places that they're not feeling celebrated, that they're feeling stifled or inhibited. And then to be very affirming that it's like, and this is not your fault, and this is actually not your burden to fix. I know that you have a lot of energy for it, and I know you have a lot of excitement to make change. But what we want to help you to do is to try to hold people accountable who it is their burden to fix this thing. And sort of saying it in that way, I think has, from their experience or from what they've shared, has, I think, opened it up to them to make it feel like it's not such a big thing. Because when somebody was talking earlier about sort of critical consciousness, but that maybe that leads to hopelessness. And sometimes it can, right? And but being able to say that it's not your burden and being very clear about that, I think kind of gives that hope, or allows that hope to take spark, as well as then trying to give them the tools and the resources with regard to how they can understand their emotions, how to work through that, how to think through how their emotions are not things to be afraid or to dampen down or to just suppress, but that they're real information for them. And it can be information to them about when I might need to take a break from some of this activism work that I want to do, where I need to listen to myself and to engage in that self-care, or I need to listen to myself and now I need to elicit some support from other people, because it's not even just all about me just being self-care. It's about how can I let other people know that I need support in what I'm feeling right now. So I'm thinking a lot about when I'm asking youth to kind of share and to partner and work with me, that I'm also trying to pour into them resources that allow them to take care of themselves and also connect them with people and resources that can support them and take care of them.
All right, I'm just gonna add a little bit onto that. Some of the ethical imperatives, I guess, that I see in the medical field, I guess, with the youth is the lack of what they already said, like feedback, especially whenever it comes to mentally and emotionally, the mental status of a patient. Like the thing that I kind of wanted to touch on was transgender kids and stuff like that. I hear a lot of things, especially with my friends who are trans, and it's tough. And I don't have to personally experience it, but just hearing them and hearing them talk about how they're unable to go. And for some places, okay, I have a Black trans friend, and she's from not the greatest place, but she can't go and get the medical help that she wants because she's afraid of her own for her safety to come out and actually be able to do what she wants to do. And it's something that I really want to be able to see a change, and I want to be able to be a part of that change and help.
Thank you, Hannah. One last question before we open it up to the audience. We learned a lot about COVID, learned a lot about healthcare delivery and healthcare through COVID. Are there lessons that we should be taking with us, or things that we should be changing and thinking about how to better deliver services to youth as we emerge from that?
COVID has taught us a lot. I think everybody can agree with that. One thing in particular I noticed was COVID actually helped a lot of kids in their learning. Kids are doing better doing school from home than being in a classroom because, like I said, boxes. Not everybody's going to fit in a box, especially a box that's the same since education was created. And learning shifted drastically, and education didn't. And one thing I noticed was a lot of kids nowadays are really smart. You know, I think we don't give them the credit they need, and we underestimate them. They didn't wait for somebody to okay what they wanted to do. They knew what they wanted, they went and did it. We have a large group of kids who, when it was time to go back to school, some of our schools closed, some didn't, but they went and they got their GED and enrolled in college. And as they were doing it, I don't know if you want to call it a trend, but a lot of them started doing it, and they were like, wait, why do we have to go to school for 4 years if this is something we could have did in 2? You know, so then they started questioning the system. And I love it, you know, because it should be questioned, every aspect of it. So the support they're getting from their parents have shifted too. Parents are starting to see just because it is this doesn't mean that's what it is, you know. So it's exciting.
I'm probably thinking too small, but I was sort of like marveled at the way that youth would show up via telehealth, right? I had to make sure they weren't driving sometimes and that they were in a safe space, but they would show up for appointments, for telehealth visits in ways that, again, they had more flexibility with that modality than with, you know, like trying to miss school and navigate missing their other commitments and things like that, and even transportation. So my first thought went to, again, how do we make more telemedicine youth-friendly and accessible to everyone? Because I think it's a way that people can engage with the health system in sometimes a less threatening manner, and it can, again, provide more access to healthcare. But again, my biggest hope would be that youth can dream bigger than I can. And based on the healthcare delivery that happened, you know, again, we saw like a movement to push things over the counter, right? That don't have to be quite as regulated, birth control options being one of them. And so even giving people like sort of more power and youth more access to healthcare that doesn't require a physician to be involved in it. And so again, I would hope that, again, youth that are questioning our systems can dream a little bit bigger about how healthcare might change now that we've navigated through a pandemic.
Right. One of the bigger changes that I've noticed is like how a lot more people have come to terms with being different, and how people have been more accepting of like seeing different people. I mean, you still get the weird comments about being somewhere, dressing a certain way, but it's not as wide, or it's not as okay. Anyways, people are a lot more accepting than they used to be, and it's being able to see that grow throughout the years, like especially like over social media. It's really been something, and especially it's really been able to help me be more confident in being myself, and I hope that it does with other people too.
One thing that the youth have been telling me that maybe I think I was a little surprised about was around how much they valued just having space together in person from the pandemic, right? So I think that there was a lot of talk about, yes, there's all these different ways that we learn. And yes, maybe I would prefer to do some of my school stuff just online, and that would be easier for me to navigate that. But that they had just really missed being together in the same room and doing just nothing, nothing of all in particular importance. But it was that holding space together. And so that when it came time to if we wanted to talk about something that was more, I don't know, academic or something that was like more school related, they're like, okay, yeah, cool. Like, let's Zoom, let's not meet in person for that. But if it was just something social or just something to like come support one another, there's still something about the power of having space together in person that they felt really just calmed their systems. It made them feel better. It made them feel more connected. So I think it's kind of like the balance. I think sometimes people are like, what did we learn from COVID? Oh, like technology, we can do everything on technology, and that's like the only way that we should do it. And I don't think that that's necessarily what some youth are asking for. They are still asking for, let's still have space together, but there are some systems that we could better streamline or better ways that we can connect and learn that are online, and let's do that.
Thank you. But now I think we can take some questions from the audience. If we have the mics, and those I see a hand in the back.
First and foremost, thank you all again for sharing and coming to educate us. I have two questions. First, one for Hannah, and that question is, when you were talking about feedback and how important it is for adults to seek feedback from youth, can you tell us, from your perspective, the most comfortable ways for adults to seek youth feedback? And then for the entire panel, from your various perspectives and all that you do, what do you think one of the most important things or lessons that we all can learn about mental health and well-being as we move forward to working with our youth?
I think an easy answer for that would be sometimes it's best to just listen to the youth. I mean, sometimes we can be wrong, I guess, and we do need a little bit of guidance. But one big thing, especially with COVID, is we've all matured a lot, especially over these past couple of years. Being able to just talk to an adult about something, like an adult that you can trust, and being able to just sit there and talk and talk and talk, and being able to get everything off, and being able to get and share your perspective inside of the story is just great. And even if it's not a big response, you going and trying to fix their whole life for them, just saying, all right, yeah, I get that, and it's okay. I'm here for you. You can always come to me. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to try and belittle you for being younger than me. I'm not going to push you away or say that you're wrong and you don't know what you're talking about just because you're the youth.
I took a note what I think you asked that second question, so I didn't forget it, which was some lessons about what we can learn about mental health and well-being. And what I was thinking that you were asking about, what can we learn from youth about that? Is that true, or just in general?
A couple, two things. One, be intentional. They know when you're not. Two, it's not always fun. It's probably more harder than fun. To expect it and understand that, and be supportive, because even though it's hard for you as a mental health person imagine being the parent or the child or the sibling or the caregiver of that person?
For me and the work that I do, and I probably said it multiple times now already, is certainly around the power of expression and the power of emotion expression, the power of being able to have access to a space that supports you in your emotion expression is so powerful for youth's empowerment and for youth's mental health. And part of that is because when youth are provided that space to be able to say what they're feeling, to make meaning of it, to express a bit around that, it's giving them that space of validation and giving them that space of almost to like take control over when there are those big feelings that kind of disrupt their system, that disrupt their physical system, but also sort of their mental system in this particular way. And so really, whatever way that you as an adult, somebody who works with youth, you can provide them that literal space to be able to express and make meaning of that expression and to have that understanding that expression. They're not asking you to have the answers. They are asking you to listen to that expression, and that even in just the moments of expression, their systems are already starting to calm a little bit because they're able to let it out. And then it calms even more when you provide them some affirmation and validation around that. And then by the time you can get to the, okay, now let's kind of problem solve around it or tackle around it, they're in sort of the headspace to be able to address what's going on sort of more head on. And so that I think is the thing I'm learning a lot about, is just that power of expression for mental health.
I think you said it a lot more eloquently, but like asking about it doesn't cause harm, right? Like we actually have had to do the studies to prove that asking about mental health and mental well-being and suicidality, even in young children, is necessary to provide them the care that they need for mental health and well-being. But again, asking the questions is necessary, and it does not cause harm to youth to bring up situations, and even situations that are tough and happening in our community. They want the chance to express that even in like the exam room with me too. So again, things that adults might feel like they shouldn't bring up, oftentimes they're just waiting for that opportunity to express how they're responding to something like that.
I have a two-part question. And the first part of it is, how, if it is at all, resonating with the Native communities? Land acknowledgements, obviously, they're happening more and more across regions and things like that. And while I see, and I know that you can't speak for all Native folks, I do want to get some understanding of how this is helping your community, if it is helping. And the other part of the question is, what could we do to push the envelope on that, to go beyond the land acknowledgements?
Personally speaking, I get the intent when it started. Some years ago, I was down in Richmond, and I was at a gathering, and the people came over and they said, can you come up and start it off with the land acknowledgement and welcome everyone here? I said, no, I'm from up north. I'm in Dakota. This isn't my land. You know, I don't have the right to greet people to my land. The Monacan people are from this area. They didn't know that, which led me to see more, even though the intentions were well. It's just words, you know. She acknowledges that notebook came from her, that if I go take the notebook from her, is she gonna be okay with that, you know? And we had this conversation some time ago with the university, and they had the same question. What's a step further? Well, how about we give it some teeth? Speaking for UVA, because this is where we had the conversation, I said maybe do some kind of a scholarship or something for a Monacan tribal member something. If you want to acknowledge, then give it some teeth. You know, otherwise it's just, hey, we're on your land. Okay. You know, and I get it, but as a Native person, and events at home, they won't even do them. They're scared that we're gonna, because we are doing land back. You know, we're buying our land back. Our nonprofit, Nishto, 3 days ago signed the paperwork. We bought 30 acres to do our work on. And that was a super powerful land back moment where, you know, if we're gonna talk about it, then we better do it. But, you know, for any institution or anybody who wants to do that, even donate to a scholarship fund or something for the Native people in that area to further their education or whatever.
I just in that moment just wanted to, because I love emotion, and I just noticed Hannah's smile here brought me a lot of joy thinking about maybe the pride or happiness that you might be feeling at hearing, you know, we bought our land back. Other questions?
Thank you. I know I'm standing between us and the end of the day, but I had a question for Dr. Losada. I think you mentioned up front that a lot of your work is focused on social emotional learning with Latino populations. Did I get that right?
Black and brown, so
Black and
African
brown,
American,
okay.
Latino. Some
Yeah.
work with American Indian.
Yeah, so my question, it has to do with how you work to empower families and young people to, you know, embrace their health and wellness and be more in charge of their health and wellness when there are attributes of their culture that can be barriers for that. Like, for example, among many Latinos, there's no value for mental health services, for example. So I'm just wondering what you have found that works for getting around some of those cultural attributes.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I honestly kind of reflected back to them first. Emotion is a very human experience, and I think that most people, all families, parents, you know, I open up and I talk to them about their experiences with emotion, their experiences with their children's emotion, and they can talk for hours about the experience around emotion. And in that conversation, there is a recognition that sometimes my emotions feel like they're too much, or sometimes I get worried if I'm not feeling because maybe it means that something's wrong. And so it's giving them a space to kind of reflect back of like, I do think about my mental health at times, right? Or I do feel the mental burden of my experiences sometimes. And so that recognition on their own, kind of in asking them questions, I think has led them to then think about, well, okay, I do care about that. And then in a kind of a follow-up, I would say, it'd be like, well, think about somebody in your life or in your family that you think like they maybe really kind of have it together. What are some things that they do? And they'll be like, oh, you know, my granny, she like, you know, used to go for these really long walks, and she would just kind of talk to herself or talk to God or talk to somebody. But when she got upset, that's what she would go do. And kind of getting them to talk through like, what are things that I see people in my community to do that takes care of themselves? And it may not be the more formal, like I went and talked to a therapist, but it was that, oh, they went and they talked to their pastor, or I went to church, or I prayed, or I had these kind of like walking meditations, or I went and got my hair done, and starting a conversation around some of the daily practices that they actually do to take care of their mental health. And then asking like, do you think that's enough? Do you think you need support? And what does that look like? So it's much more of a conversation than it is about like what I'm finding the practices are. It's a little bit more about helping them to recognize that even if as a community there's maybe some distrust around, seeking a mental health therapist or, going to someone sort of outside of the community to be able to support their mental health, that there are things that they have been doing in their community historically that support their mental health. And are there ways that they can maybe make more of a structure out of that or make more of a support group around that? And that has opened up the conversation a lot more than just being like, you should go see a therapist, or it's really important that you go and talk about these specific mental health things.
Thank you, Dr. Lozada. Any other questions? I know we're edging up on time and everybody's starting to get glazed over in the eyes. If not, thank you so much to the panel. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for your willingness to share and to be honest and authentic.